Nobody had touched shelf 9004 in over 300 years. Dust had settled on it so thick that the labels were unreadable, and the small cleaning drones that floated through the vault had long ago decided that this particular shelf was not worth the effort. It sat in a forgotten corner of Station Ondara, surrounded by millions of identical shelves stretching in every direction like a city made of grief. Ryo Tanaka did not know any of this when he wandered into that aisle. He was lost. The map they had given him at the entry gate was designed for Lethani eyes, which could see in 4 additional color spectrums that human eyes could not. To Ryo, the map looked like someone had sneezed paint onto a napkin. He had arrived on Station Ondara 6 days ago as part of humanity's first cultural exchange with the Galactic Preservation Society. His official title was Disaster Response Advisor. His unofficial role, as far as he could tell, was to stand around looking polite while very tall aliens explained things to him in very slow voices. The Lethani were kind. That was the first thing Ryo noticed. They moved gently, spoke softly, and treated every object in the vault as if it were made of glass. Desi, the archivist assigned to guide him, had 4 long arms that she folded neatly behind her back whenever she was not using them. Her skin was pale gray, almost silver, and her eyes were wide and dark like pools of ink. She had explained the vault to him on his first day. 10 million catastrophe files, each one a complete record of a planetary disaster from somewhere in the galaxy. Famines, plagues, extinctions, wars, climate collapses, every kind of ruin imaginable, documented in painful detail and preserved forever. We keep them so that we may learn, Desi had said. Each file is studied carefully over many months. We hold reflection ceremonies. We grieve for the lost. We analyze what went wrong. It is sacred work. Ryo had nodded respectfully. He understood the value of remembering. But now, standing alone in aisle 9004, he was just bored and lost. He reached out and pulled a file from a shelf. It was a flat data tablet, heavier than it looked, with Lethani script etched into the surface. He tapped it, and a translation interface activated, converting the text into basic galactic standard that his earpiece could read aloud to him. The file was about a planet called Pariai 6, a desert world, home to a species of burrowing mammals who had built a civilization underground. Their water table had begun to shrink due to a shift in their planet's orbital pattern. The first signs appeared roughly 400 years before the end. Crops began to fail within the 1st century. Wells dried up in the 2nd century. Starvation spread in the 3rd. The local government sent a request for galactic aid 150 years into the crisis. A review committee was formed 50 years after the request. The committee published its findings 60 years later. Emergency aid was approved 20 years after that. Ships arrived 10 years after approval. That be why the time food and water reached Pariai 6, 92% of the population was dead. The remaining 8% were too weak and too few to rebuild. Within 1 generation, they were gone. Ryo stood in the quiet aisle and read the entire file in about 20 minutes. When he was done, he slid the tablet back onto the shelf. Too slow, he muttered. He did not say it loudly. He barely said it all. It was the kind of thing a person says to themselves when the answer to a problem is so obvious that it hurts. But the vault was very, very quiet, and Desi was standing at the end of the aisle. "What did you say?" she asked. Ryo turned around. He had not heard her approach. Lethani feet made no sound on the polished floors. "I said it was too slow," Ryo repeated. The response. Everything about it. The warning sign started 400 years before the collapse, and it still took over 270 years for anyone to show up with help. "That is too slow." Desi stared at him. Her dark eyes blinked once, twice. Her 4 arms tightened behind her back. "You read the entire file?" she asked. "Yes. In 20 minutes? It was not that long. Maybe 15. Desi opened her mouth, then closed it. She looked at the shelf, then back at Ryo. "That file is scheduled for formal review next year," she said. "The preparation period alone takes 4 months. The reading is done over 6 weeks. The reflection ceremonies last another 2 months after that." Ryo scratched the back of his head. "I just read it standing up in a hallway." Desi did not respond. She stood perfectly still, which Ryo had learned was how Lethani expressed shock. They did not gasp or flinch. They simply stopped moving, as if the world had become too strange to navigate. From across the vault, another figure watched. Commandant Oshari, the Bravani officer in charge of station security, stood on an upper observation platform with his thick arms folded over his chest. He had been monitoring the human since his arrival. He did not trust fast things. In his experience, anything that moved quickly was either running from something or chasing something, and neither option was safe. He watched the human slide the file back onto the shelf as casually as someone returning a borrowed book. Oshari made a note in his personal log. 1 line. The human read a catastrophe file in 15 minutes. He did not grieve. He did not reflect. He criticized the response time. Recommend increased observation. Below him, Ryo walked out of the aisle with his hands in his pockets. Already looking for the canteen, he had no idea what he had just started. By the next morning, everyone on Station Ondara knew what the human had done. Rio found this out when he walked into the common dining hall, and every conversation stopped at once. 43 alien faces turned toward him. Nobody said a word. Rio grabbed a tray, picked up something that looked like bread but smelled like wet grass, and sat down alone. He had not meant to offend anyone. That was the frustrating part. On Earth, reading a disaster report and identifying failures was just called doing your job. In the world Rio came from, speed was not disrespectful. Speed was how you kept people alive. Desi found him an hour later in the small observation lounge near the station's outer ring. She sat across from him, folding all four of her arms onto the table, which Rio had learned meant she was ready for serious talk. "I need to understand something," she said. "When you said the response was too slow, what exactly did you mean?" Rio pulled out his notebook. It was a battered thing, physical paper held together with tape and stubbornness. He opened it to a page where he had already sketched out a rough timeline. "The Pari 6 file describes a 400-year collapse," he said. "But it did not have to be 400 years. The first signs, the shrinking water table, those appeared very early. If someone had sent a geological survey team within the first 10 years, they would have found the orbital shift causing it." Desi nodded slowly. "Once you know the cause, you have options," Rio continued. "Redirect underground water sources. Import moisture generators. Modify crop strains for lower water needs. Any of those could have been started within 5 years of the initial survey." He tapped his notebook. "Total time, from first warning to stabilization, 15 to 20 years. Maybe less with proper funding." Desi was quiet for a long moment. "The Pari 6 government sent their request for aid 150 years into the crisis. That is already a failure," Rio said. "But the galactic response after the request is what kills me. 50 years to form a committee. 60 years for the committee to publish findings. 20 more years to approve aid. 10 years to deliver it. That is 140 years of process while people were starving. Those are standard protocols," Desi said softly. "I know," Rio said. "That is the problem." Desi leaned back. Her silver skin seemed paler than usual. "On Earth," Rio said, "we have had our share of disasters. Earthquakes that flatten cities. Floods that swallow entire regions. Diseases that spread across continents in weeks. And we have failed many times. Badly. Millions of people have died because we were too slow or too selfish or too blind." He closed his notebook. "But every time we failed, we learned to move faster. We built systems for rapid response. Emergency shelters deployed in hours. Medical teams on the ground in days. Supply chains reorganized in weeks. We are not perfect. We are not even close. But we understand one thing very clearly. Time kills. Every day you spend in a meeting is a day someone does not eat." Desi stared at the table. Rio could see something moving behind her dark eyes, something that looked a lot like grief mixed with doubt. "Would you be willing to review more files?" she asked. Rio hesitated. Not because he did not want to, but because he could already feel the weight of what that would mean. Every file was a dead world. Every file was a story of people who waited too long and were let down by the galaxy that was supposed to protect them. "Yes," he said, "but I want you to understand something, Desi. You might not like what I find. I am beginning to suspect that," she said. The next day, Rio formally requested access to the vault's full archive. The request went to the Station Council, a body made up of representatives from the 6 species that maintained Ondara. It should have been a simple approval. Rio was already authorized to be on the station, and the files were technically open to all Coalition members. But Commandant Oshari objected. He stood before the council in his pressed gray uniform, his broad Bravani jaw set hard. "The human has been on this station for 7 days," Oshari said. "In that time, he has already demonstrated a complete lack of respect for the protocols and traditions that govern the vault." He read a sacred file as if it were a lunch menu. He dismissed centuries of established procedure with 2 words. Giving him unrestricted access is not just unwise. It is dangerous. The council members exchanged glances. A few of them nodded, but then a Lethani elder, someone far older and more senior than Desi, asked a simple question. "Commandant, has the human broken any actual rules?" Oshari paused. "No." "Has he damaged any files?" "No." "Has he threatened anyone or disrupted station operations?" "Not directly, but his attitude is not a violation," the elder said. Motion to grant access. All in favor. The vote was 5 to 1. Oshari was the only dissent. As the council dispersed, Rio caught Oshari's eye across the chamber. The Bravani officer said nothing. He simply stared at Rio with the cold, measured look of someone who was already writing his next report. Rio nodded politely and walked out. Tomorrow, he would start reading in earnest. 10 million files. 10 million worlds that burned or drowned or starved while the galaxy filled out forms. He could not read them all. Nobody could. But he could read enough to prove a point. 3 weeks in, Rio stopped sleeping properly. Not because anyone forced him to, but because the files would not leave his head. Every night, he would close his eyes and see numbers. Populations dropping. Timelines stretching. aid packages arriving to empty cities on dead planets. He had read 412 files so far. Each one followed the same terrible pattern. A disaster begins. Local authorities notice. They send a report. The report is received by a regional body. The regional body forwards it to a galactic committee. The committee debates. Subcommittees are formed. Studies are commissioned. Decades pass. Centuries pass. And somewhere on a world nobody important ever visited, the last person of species dies alone and confused, wondering why help never came. Rio filled 12 notebooks in those 3 weeks. He developed a color system using 3 markers he had brought from Earth. Red meant the catastrophe was completely preventable with a faster response. Yellow meant it was partially preventable. Green meant it was a genuine natural event that no amount of speed could have stopped. A supernova, a rogue black hole, something truly beyond control. Out of 412 files, 379 were red. 26 were yellow. 7 were green. Over 90% preventable. Rio sat in his small quarters and stared at the numbers until his vision blurred. Desi visited him every day. At first she came out of duty because she was his assigned guide and felt responsible. But within a week, she was coming because she could not stop thinking about what he was finding. She would sit across from him in the reading room while he worked, and he would hand her his finished notes without a word. She would read them slowly, her forearms trembling slightly, and then she would place them down on the table and stare at nothing for a very long time. One evening, she finally said what had been building inside her. "We told ourselves these files were lessons," she whispered. "We said we kept them so that we could learn. But we never learned anything, did we? We just kept collecting the dead." Rio did not answer right away. He was reading a file about a frozen moon where an entire aquatic civilization had died because a heating grid failed and nobody authorized the repair for 40 years. "The vault is not a school," Rio said quietly. "It is a graveyard, and everyone has been visiting it like a museum." Desi made a sound that Rio had never heard from a Ledhani before. It was soft and broken, something between a sigh and a cry. He pretended not to notice, because she seemed like the kind of person who would be embarrassed by her own pain. Word continued to spread through the station. A small group of younger staff members, mostly junior archivists and technicians for various species, began showing up at the reading room during Rio's sessions. They did not speak. They just sat and watched him work, occasionally reading the notes he had already completed. One of them, a young Bravani named Hallie, started asking questions. She was a shuttle pilot assigned to Oshari Security Division, small for her species and far too curious for military life. She wanted to know how humans organized disaster relief. How fast could they mobilize? How did they coordinate across different governments and languages? Rio answered her questions honestly. He told her about the failures too. The times humans had been slow, selfish, or blind. The disasters that were made worse by corruption or incompetence. He did not pretend that humanity was perfect, but he made one thing clear. Every time we failed, he said, someone screamed about it. They got angry. They demanded better. And the next time, we were a little faster, a little less stupid. That cycle of failure and fury is what built every emergency system we have. Hallie nodded slowly. "We do not have that cycle," she said. "When we fail, we grieve. We hold ceremonies. We add a file to the vault, and then we move on." "That is the problem," Rio said. Commandant Oshari watched all of this from a distance that grew shorter every day. He filed daily reports to the Galactic Council about the humans' activities. He described Rio's pace as reckless, his analysis as arrogant, and his growing circle of followers as a security concern. Nobody on the council responded to his reports. That silence worried him more than any direct order would have done. On the 22nd day, Rio opened a file that was different from all the others. He almost missed it. The classification marker was the same dull gray as every other file. The format was identical, but the timestamp was wrong. Every other file he had read described events that had already happened. This one was dated in the future. That IT was a predictive model, a catastrophe that had not happened yet, but was mathematically certain to occur unless someone intervened. The planet was called Shurith 3, an ocean world, home to the Moradi, a species of gentle aquatic beings who had never harmed anyone in their entire recorded history. A stellar radiation anomaly was slowly poisoning their seas. The model projected total extinction within 120 years. The file had been generated 40 years ago. Rio read it twice. Then he set it down on the table, pressed both palms flat against the surface, and closed his eyes. When he opened them, Desi was watching him from across the room. "What is it?" she asked. "This one is not history," Rio said. "This one is happening right now, and nobody has done a single thing about it." The reading room went very quiet. Even the junior staffers stopped breathing. Rio picked up the file and held it toward Desi. "We need to talk to the council," he said. Today, the council chamber on Station Andara was shaped like a bowl, with 6 seats arranged in a half circle and a single open floor where speakers could stand. It was designed to feel calm. Soft blue light fell from above. The walls hummed with a low frequency meant to slow heartbeats and encourage patience, that Rio's heartbeat did not slow. He stood in the center of the chamber, holding the Shurith 3 file in both hands. Desi stood behind him, her 4 arms folded tight against her body. The 6 council members watched from their curved seats, their expressions ranging from curious to annoyed. Commandant Oshari stood near the entrance like a wall with opinions. 40 years ago, Rio began, a predictive model was generated for a planet called Shurith 3. It describes a stellar radiation anomaly that is poisoning the oceans of that world. The Moradi, the species who live there, are aquatic. Their entire existence depends on clean water. According to this model, their oceans will become fully toxic within 80 more years. The entire species will be extinct within 120. He paused. The council said nothing. This file was placed in the vault alongside the historical records. Rio continued. It was reviewed once, 40 years ago, and a formal study committee was proposed. That committee has not yet been formed. No survey team has visited Shurith 3. No aid has been sent. No contact has been made with the Moradi to warn them of what is coming. Alethani, council member, raised one hand. The Shurith 3 case was reviewed under standard protocol. A committee was proposed with an expected timeline of 30 more years, Rio said. I read the notes. 30 years for the committee to be formed, staffed, and funded. Another 20 to 30 years for the study itself. By the time they publish their findings, the Moradi will have less than 40 years left. And if the actual relief effort follows the same pattern as every other case in the vault, it will take another 50 years to organize. The Moradi will be dead before the first supply ship leaves port. Silence filled the chamber. I have read over 400 catastrophe files since I arrived on this station, Rio said. Over 90% of them describe disasters that were preventable. Not with advanced technology. Not with special knowledge. Just with speed. Just by showing up before it was too late. He held up the Shurith 3 file. This file is not a historical record. Not yet. Right now, it is a prediction. Which means right now, we can still change it. But only if we move. Commandant Oshari stepped forward. The human has no authority to call an emergency session. He has no authority to propose action on behalf of any galactic body. He has been on this station for less than a month, and he is already attempting to override protocols that have governed this institution for 12,000 years. Those protocols killed 90% of the worlds in that vault, Rio said without turning around. Oshari's jaw tightened. You do not understand the complexity of galactic governance. Resources must be allocated properly. Sovereignty must be respected. We cannot simply rush into another species' territory because one human thinks we should. The Moradi asked for help, Desi said. Everyone turned to look at her. She had been so quiet that most of the council had forgotten she was there. I checked the records this morning, Desi continued. 14 years ago, the Moradi submitted a formal request through the Galactic Aid Network. They reported changes in their ocean chemistry. Fish populations declining. Coral structures dissolving. They asked for a scientific survey team. She paused. Their request was marked as received. It was assigned a priority level of low. It has been sitting in a processing queue ever since. The chamber was very still. Rio did not shout. He did not slam his fist on a table. He spoke in the same steady voice he had used since the beginning. I can put together a rapid response plan using existing resources. Ships, equipment, personnel, things that are already available within the Coalition's current inventory. No special funding needed. No new committees. I can have a team ready to deploy within 2 months. And what qualifies you to lead such an effort? Oshari asked. 14 years of disaster response work on Earth. Earthquake recovery in South Asia. Flood relief in West Africa. Wildfire containment across 3 continents. I have built emergency systems from nothing in worse conditions than this. The council murmured among themselves. Rio could not read their expressions. Not fully, but he could see the division. Some were leaning forward. Others were pulling back. Then Desi spoke again. The vault holds 10 million files, she said. I have spent 80 years of my life caring for them. I believe they were sacred. I believe they taught us something. Her voice wavered just slightly. But if we cannot act on what we have learned, then the 10 million files mean nothing. They are not warnings. They are just a record of how many times we chose to do nothing. The Lethani elder who had supported Rio's vault access weeks ago leaned forward. What exactly are you proposing? An experimental advisory mission, Rio said. Small team. Limited resources. We go to Shurith 3, make contact with the Moradi, assess the situation on the ground, and begin immediate triage. If it works, it becomes a model. If it fails, you can file a report about that too. The vote was narrow. 4 in favor. 2 opposed, Oshari's representative, and 1 other that IT was enough. Rio walked out of the chamber with the Shurith 3 file still in his hand. Desi followed him. Behind them, Oshari stood alone in the bowl-shaped room, his fists clenched at his sides that he had lost the vote. But he had not lost his resolve. The ship they gave him was old. It had a name that translated roughly to adequate conveyance, which Rio thought was the most depressing name he had ever heard for anything meant to fly through space. The hull rattled during acceleration. The navigation system spoke in a dialect so outdated that even Desi had trouble understanding it. But it flew, and that was all Rio needed. His team was small. Desi had volunteered the same night the council approved the mission. She had not set foot outside Station Andara in 80 years, and she packed her bag in 11 minutes. Hallie, the young Bravani pilot who had been asking questions in the reading room, formally resigned from Oshari's security division and showed up at the hangar with her flight gear and a look on her face that dared anyone to stop her. Point 3 of the junior archivist joined as well. A fun named Sato, who was barely taller than Rio's waist but had a gift for chemistry. A Dorsher named Abi, who could process data faster than most computers. And a quiet Lethani named Run, who said nothing about why he wanted to come, but carried a bag full of medical supplies. 7 people. One rattling ship. No official backing beyond a piece of paper that said Experimental Advisory Mission. They reached Shurith 3 in 9 days. The planet was beautiful. Rio had seen pictures of ocean worlds before, but nothing prepared him for the reality. From orbit, Shurith 3 was a sphere of deep blue and green, with swirling white clouds and chains of small islands scattered across its surface like seeds. The water covered 96% of the planet. The Murata lived beneath its surface in vast underwater cities built into coral formations that had taken thousands of years to grow. But even from orbit, Rio could see the problem. Along the northern hemisphere, the ocean's color was wrong. Instead of the deep blue-green that covered the rest of the planet, there were streaks of dull gray spreading outward like bruises. The radiation anomaly was already changing the water's chemistry. The poison was slow, but it was patient. They landed on the largest island, a flat piece of volcanic rock that the Moradi used as a trading post. Within hours, a delegation surfaced to meet them. The Moradi were smaller than Rio had expected. They had smooth, gray-blue skin, wide dark eyes, and thin limbs that moved with a fluid grace that made them look like they were always underwater, even on dry land. Their leader, an elder named Pol, greeted them with a gesture that Desi translated as a deep welcome reserved for long-awaited guests. "We sent our request 14 years ago," Pol said through the translator. "We were told that help was being arranged. We have been waiting." Rio felt something tighten in his chest. He recognized that patience. He had seen in the files. The quiet, trusting patience of people who believed the system would save them, because nobody had ever told them it would not. "We are here now," Rio said, "and we are not going to wait." The team began work immediately. Sato took water samples from 12 different locations around the northern coast. The results confirmed what the predictive model had suggested, but worse. The radiation was accelerating the growth of toxic microorganisms in the water. These organisms produced a chemical that bonded with the calcium structures the Moradi used for their cities. Within 40 years, not 80, the coral would dissolve. The cities would collapse. The Moradi would have nowhere to live. The timeline had shortened. They had less time than anyone thought. Rio sat on the rocky shore that night, staring at the ocean. Desi sat beside him. Neither of them spoke for a long time. "We can build bioprocessors," Rio said finally. "Devices that filter the toxic organisms out of the water at key current junctions. If we seed enough of them along the northern flow patterns, we can slow the spread and eventually reverse it." "Do we have the materials?" Desi asked. "Some. Sato thinks she can synthesize the filter medium from local minerals. But we would need hundreds of processors. Maybe thousands. Our team cannot build that many." "Then what do we do?" Rio looked at her. "We build what we can. We prove it works. And then we ask for help." Over the next several weeks, the team worked harder than any of them had ever worked before. They built the first bioprocessor from salvaged ship parts and local coral. It was ugly. It looked like someone had welded a kitchen appliance to a rock. But when they deployed it at a current junction near one of the worst affected areas, it worked. Within days, the water downstream showed measurably lower toxin levels. The Moradi watched with wide eyes. Some of them began helping, carrying materials, diving to install anchors, showing the team underwater routes that no outsider had ever seen. Pol visited Rio one evening on the shore. The old Moradi moved slowly on land, his thin legs unsteady on the rock. "Why did you come?" Pol asked. "Others said they would. You actually did." Rio thought about it. "On my world," he said, "we learned something a long time ago. If you wait until the disaster is finished to start helping, you are not helping. You're just cleaning up. And I'm tired of cleaning up." Pol was quiet for a moment. Then he reached out one thin, damp hand and placed it on Rio's arm. "Then we will not wait either," Pol said. Back on Station Andara, Commandant Oshari filed a formal complaint with the Galactic Council. He recommended that Rio be recalled immediately and charged with operating outside his authority. The complaint was received. It was assigned a priority level. It went into a queue. The stellar radiation spiked on a Tuesday. Rio knew it was a Tuesday only because he had kept counting Earth days out of habit, a small anchor to a world that was very far away. Sato detected the spike first. She came running across the rocky shore with her short legs pumping and her data screen clutched in both hands, shouting numbers that made everyone stop what they were doing. The radiation anomaly had intensified. The original model predicted a gradual increase over decades. Instead, it had jumped. The toxic microorganisms in the Northern Ocean were now multiplying 3 times faster than before. The 40-year timeline had just become 5.5 years. For an entire species, Rio gathered his team on the shore. 7 exhausted people standing on a rock in the middle of an alien ocean, looking at numbers that meant death for millions. We have 36 bioprocessors deployed, Sato reported. They are working. The areas around them are cleaner. But to counteract this new growth rate, we would need over 3,000 processors spread across the entire northern hemisphere. We cannot build 3,000 processors, Abi said quietly. Not with this team. Not in 5 years. Not in 50. Everyone looked at Rio. He stood with his hands at his sides, staring at the gray streaks on the horizon where the ocean was already dying. He thought about the files. He thought about all those dead worlds and all those slow, careful, proper responses that arrived just in time to count the bodies. Then he thought about Earth. About every time humans had faced something too big for one group to handle alone. About the broadcast that went out during earthquakes and tsunamis and pandemics. Not polite requests through proper channels, but raw, desperate calls for help that cut through every barrier because they carried the one thing bureaucracy could never produce: urgency. Hallie, Rio said, can you get our communications array to broadcast on all open galactic channels? Hallie blinked. All of them. That is a wartime protocol. Nobody has done that outside of active military conflict. Can you do it? She hesitated for exactly 1 second. Yes. Rio recorded the broadcast that night, sitting on the shore with the ocean at his back and the stars above him. He did not write a script. He did not prepare remarks. He just he told the galaxy about the vault, about the 10 million files, about the worlds that burned and froze and starved and drowned while committees met and forms were processed. He listed the numbers from his notebooks. 90% preventable. 90%. He named the species he had read about, the ones nobody remembered because they had died waiting for help that never came in time. Then he talked about the Moradi. He described their cities of coral, their wide dark eyes. The way Pol had placed his hand on Rio's arm and said, then we will not wait either. The Moradi have 5 years, Rio said into the microphone. Maybe less. They are alive right now. Their children are swimming in those oceans right now. And I am asking you, all of you, everyone who can hear this, do not let them become file number 10,000,001. The broadcast went out on every open channel. It reached stations and ships and worlds across the galaxy. Commandant Oshari, who intercepted it from Station Andara, called it treason and filed for Rio's immediate arrest. But the galaxy had already heard. The first ship arrived 3 days later. It was a battered cargo hauler crewed by a species whose own catastrophe file Rio had read in the vault. They carried construction materials and 4 engineers. The next day, 2 more ships came. Then 5. Then 12. Within a month, over 60 vessels were in orbit around Shurith 3. Engineers from 9 different species worked alongside Rio's team and the Moradi to build bioprocessors at a rate nobody had thought possible. Supply lines formed without anyone organizing them. Volunteers showed up without being asked. The galaxy, it turned out, was not heartless. It was just slow, and sometimes all it needed was someone to shout. By the end of the 3rd month, over 2,000 bioprocessors were active across the Northern Ocean. The toxin levels began to drop. The gray streaks started to fade. Moradi children swam in waters that had been poisoned weeks before. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session. Oshari stood before them and demanded Rio's arrest for violating wartime communication protocols. Desi stood beside him and presented her own report, compiled from Rio's analysis of the vault. Over 90% of all recorded catastrophes were preventable. The evidence was undeniable. The Council voted, not on Rio's arrest, but on something larger. They voted to establish a Galactic Rapid Response Corps, a permanent body designed to act within weeks, not centuries. It will be modeled on human disaster response frameworks. Rio was asked to lead its formation. Oshari voted against it. He was alone. Months later, Rio returned to Station Andara. He walked through the quiet aisles of the vault, past the millions of shelves, past the dust and the silence and the weight of all those lost worlds. He stopped at shelf 9004, where it had all started. Desi was already there. She had come back too. The Council approved a reclassification, she said. The vault has a new name. What is it? The Archive of Lessons. Rio nodded. He looked at the shelves stretching endlessly into the dim light. And the Shurith 3 file? He asked. Desi smiled. It was the first time he had ever seen Alethani smile. It was small and crooked and a little bit sad, but it was real. Removed, she said. The first file in 12,000 years to be taken out of the vault. Not because it was lost, because it was no longer needed. Rio put his hands in his pockets and breathed out slowly. 10 million catastrophe files. And finally, one that ended differently.